My wife had an affair with my cousin, and together they had a child. My family kept this hidden from me for years, and now that I've finally found success, they suddenly want back in my life. Before I dive into everything, I need you to bear with me. This situation is complicated, and there's a lot of history behind it. I'm a 44-year-old man, married for the past 10 years. My wife, who is 41, and I have been together for 13 years, and we share an 8-year-old child. Our life is stable, and on the surface, things seem good. But before this marriage, I had already been through one failed relationship. I got married young, just 22 years old, and to this day, I still don't fully understand why that marriage fell apart. It ended in divorce 3 years later, leaving me with more questions than answers. My first wife, who I'll call Laura, had been a part of my life since we were kids. We met in middle school, grew up together, and by the time we finished college and landed decent jobs, getting married felt like the natural next step. In the beginning, things were great. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. But then, something shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Laura started to withdraw. No matter what I did to keep the spark alive, she seemed distant, uninterested. Then, just weeks before what would have been our 3rd wedding anniversary, she handed me divorce papers. No warning, no discussion, just a declaration. She was done. I fought to save our marriage, begged for an explanation, for something that made sense. But the only thing she ever gave me was a cold, detached response. She simply didn't love me anymore. That was it. No reason, no closure. I was angry, devastated, but what could I do? I had no choice but to go through with it. Dragging out the process wouldn't have changed her mind, and I wasn't about to force someone to stay who had already checked out. Since we didn't have many shared assets, the legal proceedings were quick and clean. And then, just like that, Laura vanished. She moved away, cut off all communication, and disappeared from my life completely. At first, I thought it was just her shutting me out, but then I started noticing something strange. My own family was doing the same thing. Relatives I had always been close to suddenly stopped talking to me. Calls went unanswered, messages ignored. Even my parents and my sister, people I had always assumed would be there no matter what, seemed to be avoiding me. It was subtle at first, easy to brush off as them needing space or not knowing how to support me. But as time went on, it became clear, they weren't just distant, they were cutting me out. After the divorce was finalized, I made every effort to reconnect, only to find out I had been blocked, on social media, on calls, everywhere. When I tried showing up in person, knocking on my parents' door, my sister's apartment, no one let me in. It was like I had become a ghost to them. Losing Laura was painful, but losing my family? That was something else entirely. I had no idea what I had done to deserve this kind of treatment, and with everything else I was going through, it hit me like a freight train. For a long time, I couldn't function. I quit my job, shut myself off from the world, and spent months just existing, going through the motions but feeling nothing. If not for my friends, I don't know where I'd be today. They were the ones who pulled me back, who reminded me that I still had a life to live. They encouraged me to stop wallowing and do something with my future. And so, eventually, I made a decision that would change everything. I had always dreamed of opening my own restaurant, but back when I was with Laura, I kept putting it off. There was always a reason: money, stability, the need to plan carefully. But now, with nothing left tying me down, I finally took the leap. For the first time in a long while, I had something to work toward. Something that was mine, built with my own hands, free from the ghosts of my past. I thought that chapter of my life was closed. I thought I had moved on. But I was wrong. Because years later, when my name started making headlines and my business began thriving, my family suddenly decided they wanted back in. And that's when I started uncovering the truth. I decided to name the restaurant after the suggestion my parents had once given me, a small nod to the past, even though they were no longer in my life. With the support of my closest friends, I was able to connect with a few investors, gain their backing, and start putting together a solid business plan. It took years of dedication and hard work, but eventually, I opened the doors to my very own restaurant. Looking back, it took me nearly 4 years after my divorce to get back on solid ground, both financially and emotionally. 2 years later, I met the woman who would become my wife. It happened at a gathering with mutual friends, and she mentioned how much she loved my restaurant. That simple conversation turned into something more, and before I knew it, we were inseparable. After 3 years of dating, I made the decision to propose, determined to give love another shot. A decade has passed since then, and now we have a son together, a bright, energetic kid who has brought so much joy into my life. My business has flourished over the years as well. What started as a single restaurant slowly grew into something far bigger. Today, I run my own hospitality company, overseeing a chain of hotels and restaurants that have gained a strong reputation. And we're not stopping here. Our next goal is to expand beyond state lines, to take this success even further. It's taken an immense amount of effort to reach this point, but despite the challenges, I've never once regretted the journey. That's why, when I was offered the chance to do a televised interview about my career, I accepted. To me, it was proof that I had truly made something of myself. What I never expected was that this interview would open the door to something I thought I had left behind. I didn't even consider that my family would see it. Sure, it aired on a well-known channel, but I never imagined they'd be watching. And even if they had, I didn't think they would actually show up at my workplace unannounced. But 3 days ago, that's exactly what they did. When the receptionist told me that my family was waiting for me in the lobby, my first thought was that she meant my wife and son. That would have been odd enough, given that my wife was at work and my son was in school. But then she clarified, it was my parents and my sister. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to process what I was hearing. After all these years, after decades of silence, they had suddenly decided to waltz back into my life? I told the receptionist to inform them that I was busy and couldn't see them right now, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But they refused. Instead, they made a scene, loud enough that I had no choice but to step in before security was forced to remove them. So I walked out to the lobby, bracing myself for whatever this was going to be. The moment they saw me, they acted as if nothing had changed, as if we were just picking up where we had left off. They greeted me with wide smiles, showering me with praise about how incredible it was that I had made a name for myself. They went on about how inspiring my story was and how proud they were to see me succeed. But as I stood there, listening to them go on, all I could think about was how utterly strange it felt to hear those words from the very people who had abandoned me. Then they started talking about my family, the one I had built without them. They had seen my wife and son in the interview and now wanted to meet them. It wasn't a request. It was as if they believed they were entitled to be a part of my life again, like the past 2 decades of their absence didn't matter. When I didn't immediately agree, they had the audacity to suggest that I should have done more to reach out to them after my divorce, that it was somehow my fault we had lost contact. And that's when it hit me. This was my chance to finally get some answers. For years I had lived with unanswered questions, with the nagging feeling that something about my divorce, about my family's abandonment, had never added up. So instead of telling them to leave, I made the choice to listen. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally understand why they had cut me out of their lives. I sat down with them in the lobby, and for the first time in 20 years, I let them talk. And that's when the truth came out. Laura had been unfaithful. She had been cheating on me all along, and my family knew. Not only did they know, but they had actively helped her keep it from me. They had been complicit in the betrayal, ensuring that I never found out. Even as I sat there, my stomach twisting with anger and disbelief, they tried to justify it. They claimed they had their reasons they believed were valid. But nothing they could say would ever make up for what they had done. Nothing. As it turned out, Laura had been cheating on me with my cousin, the son of my father's older brother. Once they finally admitted it, everything clicked into place. Suddenly, all the years of being ignored, all the unanswered calls, and the lack of invitations to family events made sense. It wasn't about me, it was about protecting them. My family had chosen to stand by Laura and Eric, and in doing so, they had erased me from their lives. Eric, let's call him that, was someone I had never liked. Even as a kid, he had been arrogant, entitled, and utterly insufferable. But for some reason, the rest of the family treated him like he was made of glass. His mother passed away when he was just a baby, and because of that, no one ever held him accountable for anything. He could do no wrong in their eyes, and as a result, he never faced a single consequence for his behavior. It certainly didn't help that Eric's father, my uncle, had been my dad's boss. He was the one who originally started the family business, long before my father ever joined it. So when Eric decided that he wanted Laura, and Laura willingly went along with it. My family had a choice to make, and they chose them over me. They couldn't risk upsetting my uncle, but apparently, turning their backs on me was an easy decision. Not only did they abandon me, but they also cut off all contact under my uncle's orders. During my divorce, he made it crystal clear, no one in the family, including my parents and sister, was allowed to speak to me. They followed his demand without hesitation. But the part that hurt the most? When Laura found out she was pregnant, they supposedly tried to protest. They wanted to remain in my child's life, but in order to do so, they had to keep me in the dark. Laura never told me she was expecting. I had no idea. Looking back, there were no signs, no changes, no symptoms I could have noticed. She had moved out long before the divorce was finalized, and by the time it was over, she had completely disappeared. I didn't just lose my marriage. I lost my chance to even know I was becoming a father. Now, nearly 20 years later, I learn that I have a daughter. A young woman who has spent her entire life believing Eric is her father. A daughter who has never once met me, because everyone around her made sure that I didn't exist. As my parents sat in front of me, telling me all of this like it was some tragic story they had been burdened with carrying, I felt like I had left my own body. It didn't seem real. I had to physically pinch myself just to make sure I was awake. For 2 decades, they had convinced themselves that they had done the right thing. That by staying on good terms with my uncle and helping raise their granddaughter, they had made the best possible choice. In reality, they had chosen cowardice. Instead of telling me the truth and letting me deal with the pain, they hid behind their fear of what my uncle might do. They acted like he held all the power, as if the worst he could have done was take my father's job. My dad could have fought back. He could have taken legal action. But instead, they all stood by and let it happen. And now, after 20 years of silence, after living comfortably with their decision, they suddenly wanted to fix things, because I was successful. Because now, I had something they wanted to be part of. Unfortunately for them, I could see right through it. Once they were done spilling everything, I told them to leave. I wasn't going to scream or start a fight, not in the middle of my office. But I made it very clear that forgiveness wasn't something I was capable of right now, not after what they had just told me. That should have been the end of it. But of course it wasn't. Rather than accepting that they had lost the right to be in my life, they immediately started playing the victim. They insisted that I should try to see things from their perspective, that I had no idea how difficult things had been for them, as if their pain somehow outweighed mine. I shut that down quickly. I told them point blank that the only reason they were reaching out now was because I had made something of myself. If I had still been struggling, they wouldn't have come looking for me. My words must have hit a nerve because they jumped to deny it, acting offended at the very suggestion. Then my sister, in what I can only assume was a desperate attempt to justify their actions, made the most ridiculous claim of all, that they were responsible for my success. That I owed everything to them because they were the ones who had come up with the name for my restaurant back when it was just an idea. That's when I laughed. Not out of amusement, but because of how absurd it was. They had done nothing for me. They hadn't been there when I was struggling. They didn't support me when I had nothing. My friends had lifted me up. I had built my business from the ground up with my own hands. And now, after all these years, my family thought they could take credit for it because they had suggested a name? I wasn't interested in arguing anymore. I warned them that if they didn't leave, I would have them removed. They still refused, insisting that we had to work this out. So I followed through on my promise and called security. As they were escorted out of the building, they kept trying to justify themselves, claiming that they had no other choice all those years ago. That they did what they had to do. I don't believe that. They had a choice. And they made the wrong one. They had survived 20 years without me. And I have no doubt they'll manage to do the same in the future. But that doesn't mean they've given up. 3 days later, they're still trying to reach me. They haven't shown up inside my office again, but they linger outside. They send emails to my work address, and they flood my social media with messages. They can keep trying all they want. But I'm done. Their tone has noticeably shifted, as evident from the flood of apologies filling my inbox. Every time I leave work, I spot them lingering outside, watching anxiously, hoping I'll stop and acknowledge them. But I don't. I drive past without a second glance, and strangely enough, I almost pity them. Almost. Truth be told, I've had several long conversations with my wife about all of this. No matter how I feel about my family, there's a much bigger issue we can't ignore: my daughter. A child I never even knew existed until days ago. We've been going back and forth, debating whether I should try to find her and reach out. At the same time, there's the issue of my parents and sister, who seem determined to stay in my life until they get another chance to speak with me. My wife believes that maybe, just maybe, it would be best to invite them over and at least hear them out, if only to get some kind of closure. She thinks this whole situation, the stress, the anger, the resentment, is eating away at me, and confronting them might finally clear some of that toxicity from my life. But I can't bring myself to do it. After everything I've learned, after years of silence followed by this sudden reappearance, I just don't have the emotional energy to sit in a room with them and pretend any of this can be fixed. I don't want to talk. I don't want to listen. I want them to leave me alone. So, for now, I'm doing just that, ignoring them until they give up and disappear again. But that doesn't mean it's an easy decision. My wife and I are struggling to figure out the right way forward, unsure of how to deal with any of this after 20 years of nothing. And in the quiet moments, I ask myself, am I wrong for not giving my parents an